If you always do what you've always done, you're not going to get what you used to get because the world around you has changed and you haven't changed with it.
Welcome to Scale Sessions, the podcast that helps revenue leaders like you boost sales and revenue to achieve business growth with in the trenches insights.
We can skip the fluff and focus on real-world strategies you can use right away.
Each episode brings you actionable takeaways from sales and revenue leaders navigating growth challenges like you. Let's dive into today's session and scale up your success.
So Sharon, I'm so intrigued to understand how your career, where you actually started at NewsQuest in the world of newspapers, took you to a sales and operations consultant. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
It actually started before that in retail banking. That was my first kind of job, was working in a bank. And it was, I don't suppose either of you are old enough to remember Midland Bank that became...
Of course I am.
that became
I do. I'm old enough.
It became HSBC. And it was a time that banks were moving towards a sales-orientated culture and philosophy. And we were being asked to sell stuff. And I was very much like, whoa, that's not me. That's not what I want to do with my life, with my career. I don't want to be a salesperson. So I moved to one of their service centres, which was a bit like a processing centre. And it was doing all the balancing all the checks and debits that came in. Didn't like that because that was, to me, was like working in a factory. So I needed a job. They said I was quite good at selling, even though I didn't want to do it. I got a job at my local newspaper and absolutely loved it. And I don't know whether it was because it was B2B world, whether it was advertising or whatever, but I just kind of fell into advertising. I don't know anybody that that deliberately chooses to go into sales. I think most people fall into it. And I was exactly the same. I fell into it, started off on the phones, telesales, worked my way up, left for a couple of years to go and work for Mirror Group newspapers, ended up as sales manager there, then went back to NewsQuest as like display sales manager, then group manager, then regional head of sales, and ultimately ended up running the Northwest division commercially for a group of daily and weekly newspapers. And I had a huge team, significant budget responsibilities, but it was becoming more and more evident that the newspaper industry was in decline. Certainly the print media was in decline. There was a massive shift to transition to digital. And I spent most of my time in meetings and actually not working with salespeople and coaching them or anything like that. And I think I just fancied a change, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I liked that evolution of my career of doing something, going in, let's sort this out, let's make it better, make it grow. And I just kind of put my CV out there, and I got approached by a consultant working for Lavery. I went and met them. I thought, it's a bit smaller than what I was used to, smaller team, but it meant it was a new industry. And I thought, I'll give it a go and see if I like it. And I did. And I stayed there for 14 years. And my role just gradually evolved. It was kind of like, I've always been good with numbers. Maths was my favourite topic at school. When I was at school, I used to want to be a statistician of all things. I've just always been fascinated by numbers and the story that you can tell with them. So it just kind of evolved naturally that it was like, okay, run the sales team, right? Can you run the operations side of things, the sales and ops? And let's work with finance in terms of how we can make the budgeting better, how we can make that process smoother, how I built a forecasting model so that we could forecast more accurately. All of those different things, it was just a natural evolution.
Organic.
So funny that you left the bank because you didn't want to do sales.
Yeah.
And then you ended up in sales.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I know. It's bizarre,
but there you go.
Very different kind of selling like a banking product to a consumer, to selling a service, an intangible to a client. And I think that's the thing with advertising and data, is that they're both intangibles. They're both about business development.
Sounds like data's played a really important part in like every transition through your career.
Yeah, it has. And I think I used to use data before data was a thing. I think, there's a lot of talk these days about data-driven strategies, but I think back to when I used to manage a small team of reps or, even looking after my own territory, I would always look at, well, what's my bookables? What have I got on a campaign? What does my trend look like for the ad hoc revenue? How many people do I need to knock on doors with? Because you were a rep, you were out door knocking. How many of them do I need to do before I'll get a sale? So I think I'd always used it, but not knowing what it was.
So where did this passion for data and metrics come from? Is this something you've always had?
I've always enjoyed data as an offshoot of maths. So maths was my first love. data to me is just an expansion of maths. It's the stories that you can tell with it, and it's the pictures that you can paint. It's how you can use it to really unpick a problem or understand where there's growth opportunities. Because I think so many people look at it at a surface level, and it's like, KPIs used to be a swear word, didn't it? It was a dirty word, KPIs, and I think people used to think of them as like sticks to beat people with, whereas for me, they were always a tool to help understand where you could get better and to see what was happening and see what was going on in the team itself. And that's kind of the first level that you'd look at. So, I just think it's always been there with me, I suppose.
I think you say something really important. I think so often people just present you with numbers. It's actually the story and the insights behind it. And I loved your phrase, like, how can I paint a picture with the information that the data's telling me? And that's where the value comes in.
Yeah, it's not numbers. Numbers for numbers' sake are meaningless. They talk about, metrics. There's so many different metrics today that you can measure. And I think I said on the business summit, metrics for metrics' sake are meaningless. You need what is your metric, and it's not going to be the same for everybody. It depends on what stage, what growth phase you are in your business. Are you looking at driving volume? Are you looking at driving yield? Are you looking at tightening your profit margin? It really will depend on what stage you are, what your ultimate goal is, as to which metrics are going to be important to you.
I'm really interested, Sharon, because especially as you've transitioned into this consultancy and you help other businesses, I think numbers are always super important, but then they can also be dangerous because they can be quite binary, or you can end up looking at the averages all the time, which then can be misleading. How do you advise and help people make sure they don't fall into that trap?
I think you've got to take the people into it's again, I suppose, it's the context in which they're utilised in. So if I can give you an example. So I've just completed an end-to-end review for somebody, right? That's taking their entire sales process, looking at their lead generation, all the different steps, because every sales process has different steps in it. So it starts off as a lead gen, you go through qualification, discovery call, demo, negotiate, proposal negotiation, et cetera, et cetera. You get a slippage at each of those points. When you can delve into each of them and understand the slippage that you're getting in each of those points, that then helps put it into context. So one of the areas that they weren't converting as many, ultimately leads were coming in the door, but not as many sales were happening as used to. So it's about understanding where that slippage lies. And the slippage lay in two areas. One of them was in the leads coming in and then converting into a demo stage. And the next area was from that demo stage converting into a sale. So the first bit is, well, you look at how many touch points are required to get them from a lead into a demo, how many callbacks there are, et cetera, how many appointments are made, sit rate, and exit. But also, I overlay that with listening to the calls and then ultimately listening to demos. I don't think you can separate the two. So I looked at the data on one side, and then I overlay that with the people side on the other. So that's listening to demos for tonality, for the old RS rhythm, speed, volume, pitch, how they're communicating with each other, what the kind of the rapport is like on the call. So I listened to a few calls to understand, or either on the phone or on Teams, to understand that kind of the behavioural and the attitude and how that the relationship is gelling with a salesperson and a prospect. But then to apply that en masse, I know AI, there is a certain amount of fear with some people in terms of AI. Is it going to take my job? Is it going to do it for me? But I find AI really beneficial. So I was able to, in this circumstance, after I'd listened to some calls to understand where the conversation was going and what the rapport was like, then take a load of calls, upload them into AI to summarize, but then interrogate them. So it's not just about summarizing the call, it's about what are all the questions that we need to understand in this sales process, this sales journey, whether it's, what needs are uncovered? Are they just explicit needs? Is there any deep probing that's taking place to uncover implied needs and the pain points? What discount levels are mentioned? What product specification is discussed? All the different things that you might want from your process. What level are they mentioned in that call? And then you can start saying, well, of all the demos that we do, you can analyze, like, instead of analyzing one over an hour, you can analyze, 20 in an hour, because you can speed up the process.
I think it's really interesting what you say. So that what I'm hearing is you go into the detail when you look at the numbers, because that's really important. So a lot of people stay surface level. I mean, the amount of people who I spoke to over the years who've either thought of buying Jiminy or buying Jiminy and they can't tell me their conversion rates at the different stages. So that doesn't surprise me at all. But really understanding what slips through, but then you're trying to not just look at it in a binary fashion. You're going on, what's the context of why? What's the why? Why is that happening? And whatever tools or ways or means, whether it's sitting with the team or listening to recordings.
So you've now moved to start your own consultancy and specialize in transforming data to make that revenue engine work faster and better. How do you start those conversations with potential clients? What are the first steps to bringing on a new client?
Well, once they want to have a conversation, they invariably want to know what I do. And it's my explanation is I look for where we're losing out, where you're losing in the sales process or the renewal process or the customer journey. I do make a point of emphasizing that I don't do training. Although I've delivered training throughout my whole career, that's not an area I want to specialize in. And I think there is a lot of good training companies out there, and I can advise and recommend on them. But I tell them that my job, as I see it, is to make sure that all the underpinnings are working, the foundations are right. So whether that be the work management system, the workflow that you've got in place, the different steps that each the client journey, what that client experience looks like from acquisition through to onboarding, and look at all the different data points and all the interactions that that client or potential client will have with your organization, and see where it's dropping off. Because every client has slippage points, but most clients, a lot of them, they know where they are, but they don't know how deep they're slipping, and they don't know how to necessarily switch it up and how they can stop that slippage point. So basically, in a nutshell, as you said, the way I like to talk about it is I make the engine more efficient. And it's almost like you take your car to have an annual service every year. In business today, the pace of change is so fast that you should be doing an annual service on your sales process, your sales engine, because that's the lifeblood of your organization. And if you're not doing that service check, then you're not operating at optimum efficiency.
I know it's still very early, but are you seeing similarities between where the main issues are?
Typically, what I'm seeing, people that I'm talking to, is like, what I'm doing is no longer working. That's the main thing that people, will say to you. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. That doesn't exist anymore, because if you always do what you've always done, you're not going to get what you used to get, because the world around you has changed and you haven't changed with it. So I think keeping pace with change, making sure that you're understanding new technologies that are coming in. I think there's three things that you've got to keep on top of. And we covered these at the RevOps session a few weeks ago. You've got your platform or your tech stack, whatever, and that's changing more quickly than anything else. You've got your processes and you've got your people. Now, people have changed a lot. Think about people's, what people's ambitions and desires were 6 years ago, 5 years ago, to where they are today is very different. So you've got to take people into account as well as the process. And that's why I say I look at the data and the people on top of it, because that's a factor as well in any kind of stabilization effect or growth opportunity or whatever it be that you're looking for. You've got to take all of those things into account. But those were the three key areas.
And Sharon, for some of our listeners, it'd be really helpful to give some tips on where do you think the most frequent slippage points are that businesses aren't necessarily thinking about? Any advice on what they should really start diving into?
I would dive into, when a lead first comes in, what happens to it, what journey it goes on. And actually, there's different things. There's what it looks like, what the conversion is. So understand your conversion from a lead coming through the door, understanding at a business level, at a persona level, and at an age level, what your different conversion levels are, and then who in your team is doing those conversions. Because sometimes it's a simple shift of just change the direction of flow, change the leads to go on a different route in the organization without actually having to do anything else about training or upskilling or anything else. It could just be as simple as that. The other side of it is what's happening in the kind of the latter stages of the sales call, in understanding where it's falling down. Is it falling down through they've not understood the need properly? Is it falling down through value proposition? Or is it falling down through negotiation? Invariably, it falls down because there hasn't been an understanding initially of the pain points, and the solution hasn't satisfied those pain points properly if they have been understood. Those two directions. The first thing is look at who's strongest at what leads when, and make sure you understand. I think businesses assume that, it's like I said before, I'm losing from sale. I'm getting quotes out there. I'm building pipeline, but they're building a true funnel pipeline rather than a cylinder pipe. A pipeline that doesn't go anywhere is no good to anybody. But they're building a pipeline, and I think they're satisfied because I've added to my pipeline. I've added this to my pipeline. I've added that to my pipeline. But if you never convert your pipeline, you're never doing anything. So it's, if your pipeline isn't converting, I think there are people that assume what it is without knowing what it is. So they assume it's, well, because we're too expensive, or it's because we need to negotiate, or it's because we need to just throw something else at it without really understanding why. So really look at that sales process, that sales call itself.
Yeah, I think you're right. People don't want to look at the unsexier part of the sales process often, which is getting into the detail. Like, and how did you hear about us and how good was that first conversation, versus when there's a dollar sign next to it, everyone's more interested.
Buyers have much higher expectations now.
Yeah. I think one of the things around that whole funnel is that you've got multiple teams involved. You've got sales, you've got marketing, you've sometimes got customer success involved, you've got finance. How do you balance the priorities and metrics across those different teams so they're all actually working together?
We kind of went through this at Barber, actually, because sales were prioritizing one area, and customer service were prioritizing another area, and finance another area. And I think the first thing we had to do was get everybody on the same page in terms of what was important for the business, and then you filter that down. So the importance for the business for Barber was revenue. It wasn't about sales, and it wasn't about renewal rates per se. It was about the revenue. So we did we changed people's commission structures. Commission structures drive behavior. So we developed schemes that really pushed salespeople and sales managers so that actually their primary focus also became what the business's primary focus was. So it was about generating real revenue. Forget the fact that, oh, I've got an order. It doesn't start for 3 months, so I can't see any revenue from it as a business, but as a salesperson, they were still getting benefit from it. So that was changed. So things like that, I think, is making sure that there is agreement. And I think there has to be agreement and understanding as to why we're doing the things that we're doing. So agree as a business what your key metrics are, and make sure that everybody understands where they input into it.
One thing that we changed at Go Cards was we used to have a sales kickoff and a marketing kickoff. And it was like, why are these separate? It really should be one go-to-market team. And so we used to bring them together. And then we used to do role switching. So we'd make the marketing team do the sales pitches and the sales team come up with like a content plan. And we got so many great insights there. It was such a good thing to do. I just wish I'd done it at the beginning rather than 2 years into my time there.
There's like an events team. So the events team isn't, a lot of businesses do events. They go to events. It's a good lead gen tool for them. It's a good channel. But there's so many different events out there, and sales like we should be at this one, and customer success like we should be at that one. So we created a team that's got representatives from across the business, and they decide as a collective what's important, what events, and how we're going to show up at each of these different events to help benefit the business overall.
I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is adoption of AI within teams. I think some of the sales and marketing teams to a degree who have been doing that role for a long time, like, well, this is how I do things. This has always worked in the past, going back to what you were saying earlier. And there's probably a fear of also, is this going to actually take my job away from me? How do you encourage that adoption internally?
I think it's about showing them how it can help them do their job better, because we know that there is erosion. Like you said, we're not getting the same results we might have used to by doing the same thing. So show them that, talk to them about that. If your conversions have changed, I also think sometimes it's good to flip the narrative on conversion. So, people will talk about conversions. They might say, "Oh, I'm converting, I don't know, 1 in 4." And that in their head, that might be quite good to them. But if you flip it and say, "Yeah, but you're losing 3 out of 4," How can we not lose the 3 out of 4? What can we do differently? How can AI help you? So then it might be, why did I lose, the 3 reasons that I lost these deals? What were the 3 differences? What was this one deal compared to these 3? And what are the differences in the company type, in the structure? Was there anything different in the sales process? Who were the people I was talking to in those different companies? And when if you need volume clearly to be able to do it properly, but hopefully you would see that would give you some insight into, actually, I tend to lose a deal when it's this role in this business at this level, and I do these steps. So what can I do to change that? And then it becomes like almost like a guided coaching session with them, to understand how they can adapt. Because it doesn't mean that what they're doing is necessarily wrong. It just means they need to adapt it for a different audience, perhaps.
I think that's a really interesting point. What you're saying, and I think before, most software or technology does not give you answers. Like we were talking about averages earlier, but you're actually getting outcomes now from using technology, in particular AI, which is the big shift, right? It's massive.
But you also said something really interesting. The number of companies I've spoken to are like, oh, our conversion rate's good. I said, well, okay, have you thought about whether it could be even better? And they're like, well, it's this. It looks like it's around about the industry benchmarks, which is always so dangerous. Like, you have to be very cautious with some of those. Like, well, have you ever actually really looked into the data to see whether you could make it even better? Because imagine if you can do that, the additional revenue versus trying to buy more, we're fine with it. I'm just like, oh my goodness, there's so much opportunity here.
I know, and you know what? Those small improvements don't need to be big to make a difference. So if you think about, a typical B2B sales process might have 8 stages in it. A 5% improvement at each stage, the compound growth effect on that, you're talking 40-odd% growth at the end of it, aren't you? And if you turn around, so with some minor tweaks and some adjustments and some thought and some, looking at it, so you could potentially look at up to 40% improvement in your conversion levels, in your sales optimization. Is that something that might be of interest to you?
Great reframe there. I really like that.
We have some quick fire questions, Sharon, that we do at the end, just to wrap up. What's the biggest lesson you've learned in your career?
I think it's just to be true to who you are and what you want to do. I think trying to do stuff that is not going to give you enjoyment, you're never going to do effectively. So I think we spend so much of our life, I've always said this to people, you spend so much of your life in work, it should be an enjoyable experience. And if it's not enjoyable, then you're probably in the wrong job or the wrong company.
Yeah, that's great advice. What's one habit or routine that's helped you succeed?
Detail.
That's a good, quick fire round answer there. I like that.
Book or podcast you'd recommend to anyone?
Strategic storytelling, which kind of resonated with what I was doing. It was about the importance of strategic storytelling, and it was about how to use data in conversations so that when to help you get buy-in from teams. And it's not just about the data, it's going back to what I said earlier about painting a picture, isn't it? It's about the context that is operating in and that sits within.
How do you switch off after a busy, very data-filled day?
So it's either dog walking, or if it's late on, the dog's been tired, then it would be a jigsaw.
Which female leader in your network do you think we should invite for an interview next?
I think you should reach out to Alison Jackson. She is the Group Managing Director at 19 Events. So I worked with her at UBM. She's lovely and she's an incredible lady. So
cool.
Great tip. Yeah, absolutely. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great having the time to chat to you.
Thanks for tuning in to Scale Sessions. If you found today's insights valuable, be sure to subscribe and leave a review.
Stay connected for more no-nonsense advice to help you scale your business, drive revenue, and achieve your growth goals.